The intercept landed on Hugh Alexander's desk at GCHQ Eastcote in the autumn of 1958. Decrypted, translated, flagged urgent. A Soviet long-range aviation crew training over the Baltic had complained to ground control that British radar was reaching past the horizon. The pilot used the word zagadka, riddle. He could not understand how the tracking lock had acquired his Tu-16 Badger 40 seconds before his own warning receiver lit up. The transcript was passed to a small reading room at the Air Ministry, where a wing commander signed for it, locked it in a Chubb safe, and rang Farnborough. What the Soviet airman had encountered was the early operational testing of the Bristol Bloodhound Mk I, a surface-to-air missile developed under the cover designation Red Duster and rolled out to RAF Bomber Command's V-Force bases from December 1958. The 1st Squadron, 264 Squadron at RAF Northcotes in Lincolnshire, had taken delivery that summer. By the time the intercept reached Eastcote, 3 more sites were active, ringing the bomber dispersal airfields that held Britain's nuclear deterrent. The Valiants, Vulcans and Victors that would carry Yellow Sun, and later Blue Steel to Soviet targets. The Bloodhound was the product of a problem Whitehall had refused to look at squarely until 1954. That year, the Strath Report, commissioned by Churchill and circulated within a tiny cabinet subcommittee, had estimated that 10 Soviet hydrogen bombs on British cities would kill 12 million people in the first 48 hours. The Chiefs of Staff understood reading it that interception of the bomber stream was no longer an air defense question, but a survival question. Fighter Command's Hunters and Javelins were not fast enough. The Soviet Tu-95 Bear, flying at altitude, would be over Heathrow before a Javelin from RAF Leuchars could climb to meet it. Something else was needed. That something else was Ferranti's Type 83 radar, codenamed Blue Diamond and later Firelight, paired to a Bristol Aerojet ramjet missile of unusual sophistication. The radar was a continuous wave illuminator. It did not pulse and listen as wartime radars had done. It bathed the target in a steady microwave glow and the missile rode the reflected signal home. The Soviet warning receivers, calibrated to detect pulsed search radars of the chain home generation, registered nothing until the seeker on the Bloodhound itself acquired the bomber. By then the missile was already in terminal phase, climbing on its 4 solid fuel boosters before the twin ramjets took over at Mk II. The crews over the Baltic in 1958 had no framework for what was hitting their threat receivers. They reported ghost locks, sudden warning tones with no preceding sweep. One Soviet electronic warfare officer, debriefed years later by GRU technical staff, said the British radar behaved like a torch held steady in a dark room. You do not see the beam moving because it is not moving. The Joint Intelligence Committee, chaired through this period by Sir Patrick Dean, read the Soviet confusion as a window. JIC 58-83, a paper circulated in October that year, judged that Moscow would not field a comparable continuous wave illuminator before 1962 at the earliest. That gave Britain perhaps 4 years in which her V-bombers could fly into Soviet airspace with a defensive umbrella the Russians could not yet replicate or evade. 4 years was not very long. At Farnborough, at Filton, at the Royal Radar Establishment in Malvern, engineers were already being told to draft a successor. The Bloodhound Mk I, barely operational, was being made obsolete by its own creators before the Soviets had finished asking how it worked. The man who had pushed continuous wave radar into British air defence was Dr. W. H. Penley, head of the Radar Research Establishment at Malvern, a Worcestershire site that had absorbed the Wartime Telecommunications Research Establishment after 1945. Penley had spent the war on H-2S, the airborne mapping radar carried by Bomber Command over Hamburg and Berlin. He understood, as few civilians did, what bomber crews could and could not see. In a 1953 minute to the Air Council, he argued that the next war's defence problem was not detection. Chain Home Extended could see a Tu-4 leaving Murmansk, but engagement. The kill chain had to be invisible to the target until the missile was past the point where the bomber could maneuver away. That minute travelled upward through the Ministry of Supply, where a young scientist named Solly Zuckerman read it and forwarded it to Frederick Brundrett, the ministry's chief scientific advisor. Brundrett took it to Duncan Sandys, then Minister of Supply, who approved the funding for what became the Stage 1 Air Defence Programme. Bristol Aircraft Company got the missile contract in 1949. Ferranti in Edinburgh got the radar. The split was deliberate. Whitehall did not want a single firm holding the entire weapons system, partly for competition, partly because Sir Stuart Mitchell at the ministry distrusted concentration in the post-war aviation industry. The Soviets had been watching the procurement as they watched everything procurement-related in Britain through their networks. Kim Philby, before his recall from Washington in 1951, had passed details of the Stage 1 specification to Yuri Modin, his London handler. What Moscow received, however, was the requirement: high-altitude bomber interception above 50,000 feet at ranges beyond 80 miles. Not the engineering. The continuous wave illuminator was a later innovation, developed at Malvern after Philby's exfiltration. When the first Bloodhound battery went live at North Coats, Soviet technical intelligence was working from a 6-year-old document that described a different weapon. This was the gap that produced the Baltic intercept. The Tu-16 crew had been briefed on a pulsed search radar threat. They were carrying chaff packs cut to defeat S-band sweeps. The Type 83 illuminated them in X-band, continuous wave, and the chaff was useless. The crew's confusion, reported up through Soviet PVO Strany, the Air Defense Command, eventually reached Marshal Sergei Biryuzov, who ordered a technical evaluation. The evaluation, declassified by Russian archives in the 1990s and studied by the historian Lawrence Freedman, concluded that the British were ahead by a margin of years, not months, in radar guidance. In London, the JIC was less certain of that margin than its public assessments suggested. Sir Patrick Dean's October 1958 paper had given 4 years. By 1960, GCHQ traffic showed Soviet experimental work at Sari Shagan that mirrored the British approach. The pace was faster than predicted. The Cabinet Defence Committee met on March 14, 1960, to consider whether to accelerate the Bloodhound Mk II programme, which would extend range to over 100 miles and add a more agile semi-active homing head. Harold Macmillan chaired. Harold Watkinson, the Defence Minister, presented the case. Macmillan, who privately recorded in his diary that he found the cost alarming but not as alarming as the alternative, approved the acceleration. The contracts were signed in May. Production at Bristol's Filton Works began that summer. The Mk II would not reach squadron service until 1964. In the intervening 4 years, the V-Force would have to rely on a missile that the Soviets were beginning slowly to understand. At RAF Mission in Nottinghamshire, an unprepossessing site adjacent to a wartime bombing range, 112 Squadron stood up its Bloodhound Mk I battery on December 1, 1959. The squadron's commanding officer was squadron leader Eric Macy, a former Lincoln pilot who had retrained as a guided weapons officer. A new trade in the RAF with no established career path, and considerable skepticism from older fighter command hands who regarded missiles as a betrayal of the manned interceptor tradition. Macy kept a notice board in the crew room with a single quotation from Sir John Slessor, the former chief of the air staff. "The missile does not replace the pilot. It frees him for the work only he can do." Macy told visitors that Slessor had not entirely meant it, but it was useful for morale. The Mk I site at Mission held 16 launchers, arranged in 2 rings of 8, each launcher rotating on a hydraulic turntable. The Type 83 illuminator sat on a 50-foot tower at the centre of the cluster. Maintaining the radar in the wet Nottinghamshire climate was a constant difficulty. The Klystron tubes, manufactured by English Electric Valve at Chelmsford, were rated for 2,000 hours, but typically failed at 1,400. Replacement tubes had to be shipped from Chelmsford under armed escort because the technology classification was unusually high. A single klystron failure could blind the entire battery. Macy's crews worked a 4-watch system 24 hours a day. The state of readiness was synchronized with the V-force generation cycle at RAF Scampton, RAF Waddington, and RAF Finningley, all within 30 miles of Misson. When the Vulcans went to higher alert, so did the missiles. The relationship was less about defending the bombers from incoming Soviet attack. By the time a Soviet bomber reached Lincolnshire, the V-force would already be airborne or destroyed, than about defending the dispersal airfields long enough for the V-force to launch its retaliatory strike. The Bloodhounds existed to buy minutes. In April 1960, a Soviet trawler identified by GCHQ traffic analysis as the Khariton Laptov lingered off the Lincolnshire coast for 11 days. The Admiralty understood the trawler to be carrying signals intelligence equipment. It was attempting to map the emissions pattern of the Type 83 radars. The MOD's response was characteristically British. The radars at Misson and North Coats were placed on a modified emission schedule, broadcasting in a pattern designed to suggest a different scan geometry than the one actually used. The deception was approved by Sir Kenneth Strong, the JIC chairman who had replaced Dean, and run jointly with GCHQ. Whether the Soviets were fooled remains contested. The historian Peter Hennessy, working from partially released JIC papers, has suggested the deception bought perhaps 18 months. Other historians are less convinced. What is documented is that the Khariton Laptov returned to Murmansk on April 23, 1960, and that within 6 weeks Soviet experimental sites at Kapustin Yar were reconfigured in ways that suggested they had not, in fact, understood the British illuminator's true mode. Macy retired in 1972. His logbook, deposited at the RAF Museum at Hendon, records a single entry for October 16, 1962, 3 days before the Kennedy administration would announce the Cuba blockade. Battery to readiness state Alpha. All 16 birds on rails, no further orders received. The next orders, when they came, would come fast. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which the British called the Cuba Crisis, and the Foreign Office filed under Western Hemisphere General, reached the V-Force on October 22, 1962, through an alert message routed from Strike Command headquarters at High Wycombe to the master bomber bases at RAF Scampton, RAF Waddington, RAF Coningsby, RAF Honington, RAF Marham, and RAF Wittering. Air Marshal Sir Kenneth Cross, Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command, signed the order. The V-Force went to Alert Condition 3, requiring crews to be at 15 minutes readiness. The Bloodhound sites went with them. At Misson, 112 Squadron's duty crew were eating a late supper in the operations building when the teleprinter began. The teleprinter at Misson was located in the radar control cabin, fed from a hardened line buried in the airfield perimeter. The duty signaller, Corporal Geoffrey Hodson, tore the sheet at 1947 Greenwich Mean Time and walked it across the standings to Squadron Leader David Wills, Macy's successor. Wills read it, signed for it, and ordered the battery to readiness. 16 Bloodhounds, each armed with a 75-pound continuous rod warhead designed by AWRE Aldermaston, were brought to the launch position. The Type 83 went live. For 13 days, the Bloodhound batteries across Lincolnshire and East Anglia held that posture. They were not the headline weapon. The headline weapons were the Mark I Yellow Sun thermonuclear bombs in the dispersal pans, and the Thor IRBMs at 20 sites across eastern England, jointly operated by RAF crews and USAF technical officers under the dual-key arrangement signed by Macmillan and Eisenhower in 1958. The Thor missiles, 60 in number, were the primary British strategic threat to Soviet targets within their 1,500-mile range, which extended to Moscow itself. What the Bloodhounds did during those 13 days was watch. The Type 83 radars, in continuous operation rather than the modified emission schedule of peacetime, generated a volume of intelligence the Soviets had not previously been allowed to observe. GCHQ Cheltenham, the organisation had begun its move from Eastcote to Gloucestershire in 1952. with the transfer largely complete by the early 1960s. Recorded Soviet ELINT traffic from the Khariton Laptov-class trawlers spiking on October 24th. The Soviets were finally getting good data on the British weapon. The Foreign Office assessment, in a paper drafted by Sir Harold Katia and circulated to the Cabinet, was that the operational requirement to maintain the alert outweighed the intelligence cost. Macmillan agreed. The Prime Minister's involvement with the air defence question during the Cuba crisis was less public than his telephone diplomacy with Kennedy. The transcripts of the Macmillan-Kennedy calls released by the Kennedy Library in the 1990s show Macmillan repeatedly returning to the question of British dispersal readiness. On October 26th, he told Kennedy that the V Force was as ready as we have ever been and probably as ready as we shall ever be. He did not mention the Bloodhounds. He did not need to. The whole architecture, Vulcans on QRA, Thors-fueled Bloodhounds on rails, was understood by both governments as a single system. When Khrushchev's letter agreeing to withdraw the missiles from Cuba was broadcast by Radio Moscow on October 28, 1962, Bomber Command stood down to Alert Condition 4 within 4 hours. At Missen, Wills ordered the Bloodhounds back to standby. The launchers rotated to safe positions. The Type 83 went to a reduced emission schedule. The Soviet trawler off the Lincolnshire coast, the GCHQ logs noted, did not leave for another 9 days. The Mk II Bloodhound, which had been accelerated by Macmillan in March 1960, entered RAF service in March 1964 with 25 Squadron at RAF North Coats. The Mk II was a different weapon. The continuous wave illuminator had been refined into the Ferranti Type 86 Firelight radar. Deployable rather than fixed, mounted on a wheeled cabin that could be towed by a Bedford TK lorry. The missile itself carried an improved Bristol Aerojet ramjet, extended range to over 100 miles and a new semi-active homing head developed by EMI's Electronics Division at Hayes. The deployability mattered for a reason that was not made public until the 1990s. By 1964, RAF planners working under Air Vice Marshal Christopher Foxley Norris had concluded that fixed sites in Lincolnshire were targetable by Soviet IRBMs from sites in the Western Soviet Union. The Soviet R-12, which had been the missile shipped to Cuba in 1962, had a range of 1,300 miles and could reach Missen from launch sites in Belarus. A fixed Bloodhound battery once located was a known coordinate on a Soviet target list. Mobility was not a luxury but a survival requirement. The Mk II also went abroad. RAF Germany received Mk II batteries at RAF Bruggen, RAF Larbruck, RAF Wildenrath and RAF Geilenkirchen during 1965 and 1966. The German deployment was politically delicate. The Bundeswehr's own Nike Hercules sites covered some of the same airspace. Negotiations between the British air officer commanding RAF Germany, Air Marshal Sir Dennis Smallwood, and his West German counterparts went on through 1964. The eventual agreement gave the British Bloodhounds responsibility for high-altitude interception above 50,000 feet, leaving the Nike Hercules to cover the medium altitudes. The division of labour worked partly because the two weapons rarely needed to be deconflicted in peacetime exercises. In Cyprus, Bloodhound Mk IIs were deployed at RAF Episcopi from 1965, ostensibly to defend the Akrotiri Vulcan base, which held a tactical nuclear strike commitment to CENTO, and later, after the V-Force was withdrawn from the strategic role in 1969, to NATO's southern flank. The Episcopi battery was unusual because its primary threat was not Soviet bombers, but the possibility, much discussed in Whitehall during the Six-Day War in June 1967, of Egyptian Tu-16s supplied by the Soviet Union and operated by Egyptian crews overflying Cypriot airspace en route to other targets. The Bloodhounds at Episcopi were never fired in anger. They were, however, brought to readiness 3 times during 1967, twice during 1973 around the Yom Kippur War, and once during the Turkish intervention in northern Cyprus in July 1974. In Singapore, Bloodhound Mk I is of 65 Squadron at RAF Seletar, defended the V Bomber Detachment at RAF Tengah from 1964 until the British withdrawal east of Suez in 1971. The Far East Air Force used the missiles during the Indonesian Konfrontasi, when Sukarno's Air Force, equipped with Soviet Tu-16S and MiG-19S, posed a credible, if limited, threat to Malaysian and Singaporean airspace. No Bloodhound was ever launched. The Indonesian bombers, when they flew, kept their distance. The pattern was consistent across all these theatres. The Mk II's effect was not measured in kills. It was measured in the absence of overflights. Soviet and Soviet-aligned bomber crews briefed on the British radar and missile system without being given full technical detail, declined the engagements they might otherwise have flown. The riddle the Baltic crew had described in 1958 had become, by 1968, a category of missions Soviet pilots simply did not request. The intelligence picture on Soviet understanding of Bloodhound throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s was assembled at GCHQ Cheltenham and at a small SIS section in Century House. The lead officer at SIS for Soviet air defense and missile intelligence was a man known in the released files as Section R/9, whose true name remains protected. R/9's reporting drew on a thin but persistent stream of human sources. A Polish Air Force officer who defected to RAF Gatow in 1963. 2 Czechoslovak signals technicians who walked into the British Embassy in Vienna in 1968 during the Prague Spring. And, most importantly, Colonel Oleg Penkovsky, the GRU officer run jointly by SIS and CIA from April 1961 until his arrest in October 1962. Penkovsky's material on Bloodhound was indirect but valuable. He passed to his SIS case officer, Greville Wynne, technical assessments of Western air defense systems that had been circulated within the GRU's Scientific and Technical Directorate. From Penkovsky, London learned that Soviet analysis of the British Illuminator was incomplete as late as the summer of 1962, confirming the JIC's optimistic earlier assessments and validating, retrospectively, the deception program run from Misson and Northcotes 2 years before. Penkovsky was arrested on October 22, 1962, the same day the V-Force went to Alert Condition 3 for the Cuba crisis. He was tried and executed in May 1963. After Penkovsky, the human sources thinned. The Polish defector at Gatow, codenamed Cicada in JUIC files, was a fighter controller, not an air defense theorist. His material covered Warsaw Pact, ground-controlled interception procedures rather than Soviet evaluation of NATO weapons. The Czechoslovak technicians, debriefed at length in a safe house in Hampshire during October 1968, provided detailed information on Soviet Tall King and Big Mesh early warning radars, but had limited insight into the Soviet analytical effort against Western air defenses. What filled the gap was signals intelligence. GCHQ's Soviet Bloc Section, working from a windowless wing of the Oakley site at Cheltenham, monitored the traffic between PVO Strany's main staff in Moscow and the experimental facilities at Sary Shagan and Kapustin Yar. The traffic was encrypted, but the patterns, frequencies, and call signs gave structural information. By 1969, GCHQ analysts judged that the Soviets had developed their own continuous wave illuminator, designated by Western intelligence as Flaplid, deployed with the S-300 air defense system. The Soviet equivalent had taken 11 years to reach operational status from the date of the original Bloodhound intercept. That 11-year lag was the British air defense community's principal achievement of the Cold War. It was not advertised. The Defence White Paper of 1969, presented to Parliament by Dennis Healey as Secretary of State for Defence, made no reference to it. Healey, who had been at the Treasury during the Bloodhound, Mark II decisions of 1960 and understood the program's history, treated the radar achievement as a national secret of the highest sensitivity. He noted in a private minute, released by the National Archives in 2007, that the longer the Russians do not understand what we are doing in Lincolnshire, the longer Lincolnshire continues to exist. By the early 1970s, the question facing the MOD was not whether to maintain the Bloodhound force, but how to extend its life until a successor, eventually the Rapier for low-level defence, and much later the abandoned Bloodhound, Mark III concept, could be developed. The Mark II was already an aging weapon. The radar that had bewildered the Baltic crew of 1958 was, by 1972, 15 years old. The Soviets finally were beginning to understand it. The British by then were preparing to replace it. The withdrawal of Bloodhound from the United Kingdom air defence role began in the late 1970s, accelerated through the early 1980s, and ended in July 1991, 6 months before the Soviet Union itself ceased to exist. The decision-making record runs through 3 defence reviews: the 1974 Mason Review under Roy Mason as Defence Secretary, the 1981 Knott Review under John Knott, and a final disposal study undertaken in 1988 under George Younger. The Mason Review, written in the shadow of the 1973 oil shock and Britain's IMF crisis, had recommended consolidating Bloodhound sites from 11 to 5. The 1981 Knott Review went further. Knott, a former Royal Marines officer and Treasury Minister whose review was overshadowed by its naval cuts and then by the Falklands War of April to June 1982, proposed phasing out Bloodhound in favour of the Tornado F.3 interceptor entering service, with 2290 CU at RAF Coningsby in 1984. The argument was that a long-range manned interceptor armed with Skyflash missiles could cover the same airspace at lower cost. The argument was contested. Air Chief Marshal Sir Keith Williamson, Chief of the Air Staff from 1982 to 1985, opposed total withdrawal. Williamson's view, expressed in a minute to Michael Heseltine when Heseltine succeeded Knott as Defence Secretary in January 1983, was that the Tornado F.3 could not be in 2 places at once. Bloodhound, fixed but always available, provided what Williamson called the irreducible minimum of air defence. Heseltine accepted the argument in part. The Bloodhound force was reduced but not eliminated. By 1985, 4 squadrons remained operational. 25 Squadron at RAF Whiten in Cambridgeshire, 85 Squadron at RAF West Raynham in Norfolk, and detachments at RAF Bawdsey in Suffolk and RAF Wattisham. What kept Bloodhound alive into the late 1980s was a single Soviet aircraft. The Tupolev Tu-22M backfire, which had entered Soviet long-range aviation service in 1972 and was upgraded through the 1970s and 1980s, was a swing-wing supersonic bomber capable of carrying the Kh-22 cruise missile against NATO naval forces and rear-area airfields. The backfire's altitude and speed performance, Mach 1.88 at altitude, with a combat radius that, at low-level penetration profiles, brought British targets within range from Soviet bases, created a problem the Tornado F.3 could solve only with very rapid scrambling. Bloodhound, on standing alert, did not need to scramble. The continuous wave illuminator was already running. The missiles were already on rails. The JIC's annual threat assessment, JIC 85, judged that a Soviet conventional or nuclear strike on the United Kingdom in the opening hours of a NATO-Warsaw Pact war would involve 40 to 60 backfires routed across the North Sea from bases in Estonia, Latvia, and the Kola Peninsula. Bloodhound at Bawdsey covered the eastern approaches. Bloodhound at Whiten covered the V-bomber successor bases, by then carrying the Tornado GR.1 with WE.177 nuclear stores, and a small force of Vulcan B.2s retained until 1984. The end came not from Soviet capability, but from Soviet collapse. The Reykjavik summit between Reagan and Gorbachev in October 1986, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty signed at the White House in December 1987, the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan completed in February 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989, the German reunification of October 1990, and the formal dissolution of the Warsaw Pact in July 1991. Together, these removed the threat that Bloodhound had been designed to defeat. The last operational Bloodhound stood down on July 17, 1991 at RAF West Raynham. The retired Bloodhounds went various places. Some were preserved. A Mark II sits today at the Royal Air Force Museum at Cosford, near Wolverhampton, painted in the standard pale grey scheme of 25 Squadron. Another is at the Imperial War Museum at Duxford. One was sectioned for instructional use at the RAF Guided Weapons School at RAF North Luffenham in Rutland, until that establishment itself closed in the early 1990s. Many were simply scrapped at MOD disposal sites in Wiltshire and Yorkshire. The Type 86 Firelight radars, classified material until the late 1990s, were destroyed under controlled conditions. The Baltic intercept of 1958, the Soviet airman's Zagadka, had set in motion a program that lasted 33 years. Across those years, the British Air Defence Radar Establishment, working from Malvern and Bawdsey and Cheltenham, had sustained a technical advantage longer than the original JIC papers of 1958 had thought possible. The advantage had been earned by people whose names are mostly absent from the published histories. The Klystron technicians at English Electric Valve in Chelmsford, the Ferranti radar engineers in Edinburgh, the Bristol Aerojet ramjet designers at Filton, the GCHQ Soviet Bloc analysts at Oakley, the JIC drafters in the Cabinet Office. A few names did emerge: Sir Robert Cockburn, who had directed radar research at Malvern from 1953 to 1959, and chaired the Defence Research Policy Committee in the 1960s, was knighted in 1960, and lived to see Bloodhound retire. Sir William Cook, Aldermaston's deputy who had overseen the development of the continuous rod warhead in the 1950s, died in 1987. Hugh Alexander, the GCHQ codebreaker, whose desk had received the original 1958 intercept, died in 1974, having spent his post-Bletchley career running GCHQ's H Division. His obituary in the Times mentioned chess, at which he had been a British champion, but not Bloodhound. The deeper question, what the British radar achievement meant for the Cold War as a whole, has been addressed by historians cautiously. Sir Lawrence Freedman, in The Evolution of Nuclear Strategy, treats British air defence as a footnote to the Central American-Soviet strategic balance. Peter Hennessy, in The Secret State, gives it more weight, noting that the credibility of the V-Force as a delivery system rested partly on the credibility of the air defence of its dispersal airfields. Christopher Andrew, in his Authorised History of the Security Service, touches the question only obliquely, focusing on counter-espionage against the Soviet ELINT effort. What can be said with confidence is that the Soviet long-range aviation crews who flew toward British airspace from 1958 onward, over the Baltic, the North Sea, the Norwegian Sea, operated under a particular form of uncertainty. They did not know with the precision their tactical doctrine demanded when they would be detected, when they would be locked, when the missile would launch. The British air defence system gave them silence where they expected warnings, and warnings where they expected silence. The Soviet response, after years of analytical work, was the flap-lid radar and the S-300 missile, fielded in 1978, 20 years after the Baltic intercept. The riddle had been solved eventually. By then it no longer mattered. The Soviet Union had 11 years to live, and the British had moved on to other secrets. What survived was the lesson Penley had articulated in his 1953 Minute to the Air Council, that the deepest form of deterrence is not visible, the aircraft that does not fly, the crew that does not request the mission. the missile that does not need to be launched because the bomber it would have killed never crossed the coast.